Okay, so, those of you familiar with my channel are probably wondering, hey, isn't there going to be a Silent Hill 4 video coming out right about now? It's the 20th anniversary and all that. Surely you're going to make another one of those big 20th anniversary videos, right? And, well, if you are that person, I have some bad news for you. There isn't going to be a Silent Hill 4 video. Silent Hill 4 The Room is often referred to as the black sheep of the franchise, for a multitude of reasons. The changes in structure to its overall gameplay compared to the original trilogy, the use of its characters and its combat, and the general direction of its story. There's a bunch of things going on in The Room that renders it a legitimately interesting, yet very divisive little beast. It's a fascinating addition to the series, but I have to admit that it's also one that I'm not a huge fan of. As a result of this, for the last 2 months or so, I've been pulling my hair out trying to put together a video on The Room that doesn't just come across as me whinging about the game for half of its runtime. And after much deliberation, I've come to the conclusion that releasing a 20 to 30 minute video of me mostly complaining about my favorite franchise just isn't the kind of video I want to make. So I decided to refocus my attention onto something else, to look for something perhaps inspired by Silent Hill that, in my opinion, offers the exact level of fear and dread that I look for in a horror experience. Something that scratches that creative itch and gets me excited to talk about it, which more importantly embodies the entire reason I even started making these videos. And what I found was lost in Vivo. Originally released in November of 2018 via the indie developer Kira, Lost in Vivo is a game that centers its premise around the kind of nightmare fuel that only an animal lover can truly understand. Your faithful doggo has been dragged into the sewer due to a sudden flood whisking them away, and so you must now enter the tunnels in search of your furry companion. However, Danny the corgi might not be the only thing down there. For those of you who might recognize the developer's name, yes indeed, Kira is none other than the mind behind Spooky's Jump Scare Mansion. Or rather, Spooky's House of Jump Scares, if you happen to remember the OG version of that game, before a bullshit cease and desist from a German mobile games company resulted in the developer having to change it in 2016, due to said company attempting to trademark the term Spooky House. Joke's on them, because now every time they post anything on Twitter, people still give them shit for it, and it's about the only thing people associate with that company anymore. The point is, while I personally don't have anything against the adorably petrifying Spooky Awookie, you might not have been expecting a legitimately tense, psychologically driven horror game from the same dev who created what was well known at the time to be something of a meme horror game, which may or may not make Lost in Vivo all the more impressive. Because when it's at its very best, Lost in Vivo can be downright terrifying. Here's the thing about Lost in Vivo. The monsters themselves aren't the scariest things in the world. The low polygon PS1 inspired aesthetics draws heavily from the likes of 90s era Silent Hill and Resident Evil, which still remains one of my favourite gaming aesthetics of all time, but it also doesn't really make for the scariest visual style in the world. There's only so much you can do with a blocky blob that hobbles around looking like it's struggling with the simple act of walking, let alone trying to kill you. No. Where Lost in Vivo renders this particular aesthetic a nerve-shreddingly tense experience is through its combined use of meticulously crafted sound design and atmosphere. Throughout each of the many areas you'll explore, the game's use of droning ambience, a gnarly soundtrack, and truly grotesque monster sound effects elevates so much of Lost in Vivo's horror to such a tangibly frightening level. gradually raising the tension of simply walking through the dank, dingy hallways to the point that when you do finally encounter a monster, after having nervously looked over your shoulder for the 5th or 6th time when a distant bang or howl echoes in the distance, it scares the ever-loving bejesus out of you. It's something that the similarly visually limited Fear and Hunger also executes to a fantastically impactful level, the act of using sound design and music to do the heavy lifting when the visuals aren't capable of pulling off the level of horror that you might be going for, which also happens to be the exact mantra that Lost in Vivo's primary influence utilized so effectively in 1999, the original Silent Hill. And by extension, the leading sound director and composer of that franchise, Akira Yamaoka. Make no mistake, Yamaoka's influence is all over this game, from the dissonant piercing synthesizers to the crunchy industrial percussion or the shrieking monster audio effects, as is the overall visual influence of Silent Hill's hellishly rusty Otherworld, which makes its presence very well known throughout Lost in Vivo as your descent into madness gradually intensifies. As a result of this, playing Lost in Vivo in the dark with a decent set of headphones is an absolute uncompromisable must. To get the full weight of this experience, you need to meet it halfway and truly immerse yourself in the game, which then only opens the gateway for Lost in Vivo's more elaborate examples of dread and atmosphere, one in particular being the exact kind of subtextual messaging and subject material being conveyed to the player through the game's monster design and environmental storytelling. While the primary objective indeed revolves around the simple matter of rescuing your doggo, Lost in Vivo touches on a lot of subject material, and it really doesn't shy away from getting into the kind of topics that can definitely be considered sensitive, some of which including tocophobia, bulimia and body dysmorphia, domestic abuse, animal testing and experimentation, and above all else, post-traumatic depression, psychosis, and mental illness.
What are you hoping to accomplish? Without me, you're just hollow.
To offer an example, there's a particular section of the game in which you are forced to choose between one of two looping hallways, with each entrance being indicated by a picture, the idealized example of Beauty Hallway or the grey, disfigured, ugly hallway. Your gut instinct might be to choose the beautiful hallway, but therein lies the trick question of the decision, with the game punishing you with monsters if you do. You aren't supposed to aspire to the idealized example of superficial beauty, a media trend which has become truly damaging throughout the years. The journey towards true happiness instead lies on working through and gradually accepting those parts of you that, try as you might and no matter how afraid of them you may be, aren't going to change by running away from them. But in facing those fears and gradually working on bettering yourself as a human being, you will gradually achieve internal happiness and acceptance in simply being who you are, with the grey photo shifting from a disfigured image into a far more natural example of the human form as you gradually proceed through each loop of the hallway. Because at the end of the day, nobody's perfect, and we need to accept that if we want to be happy. It's our flaws and mistakes that make us human. But accepting those flaws and working to better ourselves is the only true route to being happy. However, with that being said, if you don't want to focus too much on the symbolism and simply wish to play the game as a straight-faced survival horror, you can do that too, with much of the game's subtext being relegated to environmental storytelling and collectible notes. An average horror enjoyer with little interest in delving deeper can still have a good time with Lost in Vivo. But that is a good time with some caveats. For starters, while the game's horror combat is perfectly functional, it isn't all that remarkable either. The gunplay and melee weapons are fine and they do their job, but the main issue I take with the game is more so in regards to the simple act of navigating these locations. While the overall design of these environments is nice enough for the aesthetic they're going for, they can often fall prey to the trap of being rather samey, with assets and hallways feeling a little bit too duplicated, especially when reaching the larger locations. While you can collect Silent Hill-esque maps, these unfortunately don't update with any accumulative information, which can often result in the player easily getting lost or running around in circles looking for the umpteenth version of the exact same door that you just haven't managed to get through yet. Let's be honest, we're already borrowing so much from Silent Hill here, with some very direct references in the game. So at this point, throwing the updating map mechanic into the mix isn't really going to offend anyone who's already willing to accept how much Lost in Vivo already justifiably owes credit to that franchise. With that being said, however, the overall experience of the game, with it lasting approximately 4 hours in runtime, is still plenty enjoyable. The variety in monster design is a really nice surprise for such a short game, as is the creativity in some of the game's puzzles and its willingness to explore such a vast array of topics and subject material, many of which could have come across as ham-fisted or insensitive if it wasn't handled in the legitimately careful manner that Lost in Vivo for the most part does achieve. The sound design and music is downright spectacular, easily being the game's greatest asset with which the majority of its horror draws from, and the sheer level of tension and fear instilled on the player throughout Lost in Vivo's greatest moments offers some of the best examples of indie horror gaming of the last 5 to 10 years. In short, Lost in Vivo is the exact kind of experience that you might want to pick up if you need something to scratch that post-Silent Hill glory days itch. A game which takes substantial influence from the classic late 90s to early 2000s era of survival horror and succeeds in transforming them into something new while also still feeling very familiar. If you're looking for something like that, I recommend the psychological terror of Lost in Vivo. Hey everyone, thanks for watching the video. I'd like to give a shout out to my amazing top Patreon supporters, Game Master, Dark Raptor 86, BFD Survivor, and Shkotsky. I'd also like to apologise if the absence of a Silent Hill 4 video is disappointing for anyone. I figured a more positive video on a game that I actually like would make for a far more enjoyable watch, rather than a 20 to 30 minute whinge fest on a game that I do still like, but also have a lot of issues with. Take care everybody, I'll see you in the next video.